still! Stay down!
Why are they hunting me? You know who I am.
I know you must survive.
Luminina Prime never truly stopped moving. That was the thing people forgot to mention when they described it. They told you about the scale, the sheer size of the station, wide corridors that stretched so far you could not see the end of them. They told you about the aliens, hundreds of species gathered in one place, which sounded exciting in theory and in practice meant a constant low-grade chaos of competing smells, overlapping languages, and everyone convinced that their business was the most urgent thing happening within a 10-meter radius. They told you about the lights, the trade goods, the way the market district looked like someone had shaken a galaxy loose and let the pieces fall wherever they wanted. What they did not tell you was that even at what the station clocks designated as 3 in the morning, Luminina Prime was still going. Merchants arguing over exchange rates, ships coming in from the outer sectors. Somewhere in the lower district, two groups of aliens were having a disagreement that had started over the price of something and escalated into something considerably more personal. Nobody moved out of the way for anyone else, and the crowd absorbed newcomers and spat out veterans with equal indifference. Jacob had been on the station for 6 days and had not slept for more than 4 hours at a stretch. He was running low on credits, which was a problem. He had leads on 3 potential jobs, all of which had fallen through in the last 48 hours, which was a bigger problem. And he had heard, through the particular grapevine that existed in places like this, where information was traded as casually as physical goods, that a Vrexian bounty hunter named Invalik was in the market for an assistant. Nobody else seemed to want the job. Jacob had asked around enough to understand why. Invalik had a reputation that was less a description of his character and more a series of warnings stacked in a row. Efficient, cold, works alone, does not explain himself, has been known to leave partners behind when situations became inconvenient. The last person who had tried to assist him on a job had apparently walked away with a mild concussion and a strong desire to change career paths. Jacob had considered all of this carefully and decided to approach him anyway. He found Invalik in the main market corridor, which was not difficult. Invalik was a head taller than most of the crowd around him. Dark green scales catching the overhead lights as he moved. 4 glowing eyes scanning everything and resting nowhere for long. He walked with the particular unhurried certainty of someone who had learned that moving too fast in unfamiliar territory was how people got hurt. And he was currently steering toward the docking bays with the purposeful energy of someone who had finished their business and was ready to leave. Jacob stepped into his path. "Excuse me, sir." Invalik stopped. He turned around slowly, the way large. Dangerous creatures turned when they were not startled, but were choosing to acknowledge something that had gotten their attention. All 4 eyes landed on Jacob, and for a moment he just looked at him. The full look, the taking in the whole picture look that Jacob had learned over the past week, meant a Vrexian was deciding whether something was a threat, an inconvenience, or just an object that had wandered into their field of vision by accident. Jacob extended a hand. He had read that humans did this, offered the hand thing. Most species found it either confusing or mildly unhygienic, but it gave him something to do with his body while Invalik decided what category he fell into. "My name's Jacob. I heard you might be looking for an assistant." Invalik's gaze dropped to the extended hand, then came back up to Jacob's face. He did not take the hand. "Where did you hear that?" he said. His voice was low and rough, like rocks settling, and it was not quite a question. "Around, I ask a lot of questions. People answer them to get me to stop asking." Jacob lowered his hand without embarrassment. "I also heard you've been through 4 potential candidates in the last 2 weeks, and that the position is still open. So either your standards are very high, or your interview process is memorable enough that people are opting out on their own. Either way, I figured I had a reasonable shot. You figured wrong, maybe, but you're still standing here." Invalik looked at him for another long moment. Then, without any particular change in his expression, he laughed. It was not a warm sound. It came out deep and sudden, more like a geological event than a social one, and a nearby merchant startled badly enough to drop a small crate of something that rolled under a stall table. Invalik did not look over at the commotion. He was still looking at Jacob. "You wouldn't last a day," he said, and turned back toward the docking bays. Jacob followed him. This was apparently not what Nvalik had expected, because he glanced back after 3 steps with the expression of someone who had dismissed something and was surprised to find it still there. "I didn't invite you to come with me. You didn't tell me to leave," Jacob pointed out. "Look, I know I don't look the part. I get that. But I'm useful in specific ways that might actually matter for this kind of work. I can fix most standard machinery in under an hour if someone hands me the right tools and leaves me alone. I'm good with navigation systems, old and new. I've got a scanner that reads energy signatures in environments where most commercial equipment loses signal, and I'm good at staying calm when things are going wrong, which, from what I hear, is a relevant skill in your line of work." They had reached the entrance to the docking corridors. Nvalik paused there, one hand on the door panel, and turned to look at Jacob, again with the particular quality of attention that suggested he was actually listening now rather than just waiting for the sound to stop. "You're good at staying calm," he repeated. "Genuinely. Yes. I know that sounds like something anyone would say, but I can actually back it up. I grew up in an environment where things went sideways on a regular basis. I learned early that panicking made everything take longer to fix." "What kind of environment?" Jacob considered the question. "One with a lot of machinery and not enough people who knew how to operate it. Anyway, the point is that I've got useful skills. I learn fast, and I genuinely don't have anywhere else to be right now. Give me one mission. If I'm more trouble than I'm worth, you can tell me to clear out, and I will. No arguments." Nvalik was quiet for long enough that Jacob started mentally preparing a follow-up pitch. Then Nvalik pushed the door open and walked through it. "One mission," he said. "You stay out of my way. You do what I tell you when I tell you. And if you slow me down, you find your own way back." Jacob pumped his fist once, quickly, and fell into step behind him. He was smart enough not to say anything else right then. The first job Nvalik walked him through was, by bounty hunter standards, about as straightforward as they got. A collector in the Upper Market District had reported a Vrexian cultural artifact stolen from his private display case 3 days ago. The artifact was small, valuable, and distinctive enough that moving it through the station's regular trade channels would be difficult without someone noticing, which meant the thief was almost certainly still on station, sitting on the item while they arranged a more discreet sale. Nvalik had already narrowed the likely location to the station's lower infrastructure levels. Based on energy trace patterns, the collector's private security had been kind enough to share in exchange for a fee that Jacob chose not to ask about. "The underbelly," Nvalik said as they took the lift downward, watching the floor numbers decrease. "Most people don't go down there unless they have to. The lights are unreliable. The air recyclers are old. Station security checks it twice a week, which means there are 6 days in between when nobody's paying attention." "Sounds like the kind of place you'd hide something," Jacob said. "Or someone." The lift opened onto a corridor that smelled like recycled coolant and something underneath it that Jacob could not identify, but that made him want to breathe shallowly. The overhead lights were the older, yellower kind, and 2 of them were flickering with the resigned consistency of things that had been flickering for a long time and had given up, expecting maintenance. The walls were close together. The sound of the crowd above them had faded to a distant vibration. Something felt more than heard. Jacob pulled out his scanner and powered it on. It woke up with a series of soft beeps, the screen casting a faint blue light across his hands. Nvalik glanced at it. "That's held together with tape. Industrial adhesive, actually. It's stronger than it looks." Jacob ran his thumb across the interface, adjusting the sensitivity. "Vrexian artifacts have a specific resonance pattern. I calibrated for it before we came down. Give me a second." The scanner worked through its sweep. The reading came back faint but clear, pulling toward the left branch of the corridor ahead of them. "He went left at the junction," Jacob said quietly. Nvalik raised what might have been an eyebrow, though on a Vrexian the gesture was harder to read than on a human. He looked at the scanner, then down the left-hand corridor, then back at the scanner. Then he started moving. They went carefully. Nvalik moved the way Jacob imagined large predators moved in environments where making noise meant failing, not just being rude. His footsteps were nearly silent despite his size. Jacob did his best to match his pace, though with less success. The scanner beeped once, quietly, when they were about 30 meters down the corridor, and Jacob glanced at the reading. Closer. he murmured. 20 meters. Maybe a bit less. Nvalek nodded once. His hands were loose at his sides. Ready. The shadow came out of an alcove so fast that Jacob almost missed it entirely. It was small and low to the ground, and moving at the kind of speed that comes from having spent a lot of time running away from things. In his peripheral vision, Jacob registered the faint glow of something tucked against the figure's chest. Nvalek was already moving. What happened next was not so much a chase as a single extended motion on Nvalek's part, efficient and fast and completely without hesitation. The thief scrambled up from the floor, where the initial collision had knocked him, and bolted down the corridor. Nvalek followed. Jacob, who had not been standing in quite the right position and had needed a fraction of a second to process what was happening, followed behind. He did not see the cable stretched across the corridor at shin height. The floor came up to meet him with unpleasant speed. He lay there for a moment, doing a quick internal inventory to confirm that nothing had broken, then pushed himself upright. His jacket was dusty. His knees would probably be unhappy tomorrow. His pride was managing, largely because he had extensive practice at maintaining it through undignified situations. When he reached Nvalek, the hunter had the thief pinned against the far wall with one arm, the thief's feet a few centimeters off the ground. The artifact was in Nvalek's other hand, glowing quietly, its light pulsing with slow regularity, like something breathing. The thief was very still, which was the correct and sensible response to being held against a wall by a Vrexian. Nice, Jacob said. He looked at the thief with genuine, uncomplicated curiosity. Hey, probably not worth it, right? In hindsight. The thief blinked at him but said nothing. Nvalek transferred the artifact to Jacob, produced restraints from somewhere on his person, and secured the thief with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this so many times it no longer required his full attention. Jacob held the artifact and turned it over carefully in his hands. It was heavier than it looked, solid and cool, and the light in its center moved in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. Don't activate it, Nvalek said, without looking up from what he was doing. I wasn't going to. You were holding it like you were thinking about it. Jacob adjusted his grip to something less exploratory. I was just looking. It's a good object. Whoever made this was careful. He paused. What is it? Not your concern right now. They made their way back up through the lower levels, with the thief in tow, and Nvalek had the presence of mind not to point out that Jacob's jacket had a tear across the left elbow from the fall, which Jacob appreciated. In the corridor above, where the lights were better and the air was cleaner, they handed the thief off to the collector's private security. The collector himself was a middle-aged Drathian with too many fingers, and the particular relief of someone whose valuable thing had been returned before he had to explain to anyone how it went missing. The payment was transferred. They walked back toward the docking bays. The scanner was useful, Nvalek said. Eventually. I know, that's not a compliment. It's an observation. I can take an observation. They walked in silence for a while. Jacob could see the entrance to Nvalek's docking bay ahead, the number above the door, confirming they were in the right place. He had been assuming the natural endpoint of this interaction was that Nvalek would tell him to leave, and he had been preparing himself for that, running through whether there was another angle he hadn't tried yet, or whether the reasonable thing to do was accept that one shot had been offered and take what he could get from it. Callan, Nvalek said. Jacob stopped walking. What? We're leaving for Callan 4 in an hour. That's the next job. Artifact delivery. Nvalek pushed open the docking bay door without turning around. Don't be late. Jacob stood there for a moment, taking this in. Then he followed him through the door. The Iron Fang was not what Jacob had been expecting, though he was not entirely sure what he had been expecting. It was small, angular, and built for function over impressiveness, with the slightly scuffed exterior of a ship that worked for a living and didn't stop working long enough to get polished. Inside, it was clean in the way working spaces get clean when someone maintains them out of necessity rather than preference. Everything in its place because having things in the wrong place cost time. Jacob stowed his backpack in the compartment Nvalek pointed him toward, settled into the co-pilot seat when indicated, and did not touch anything unless asked. The pre-flight checks happened quickly and quietly, Nvalek moving through them with the reflexive ease of someone who could do them in his sleep, and probably had. The engines woke with a low, steady sound that Jacob felt more in his chest than heard. The station fell away through the viewport. The crowd, the noise, the overlapping urgency of Luminina Prime, all of it contracted and diminished until it was just a shape against the dark. And then the shape was gone too, and there was nothing but space in every direction. Jacob pressed his forehead against the viewport, which he knew was probably not the most professional thing to do. But he had stopped being embarrassed about it after the first time. Every single time, he said, quietly, not directing it at anyone. What? Nvalik said, from the pilot's seat. Space, it never gets old. He pulled back from the viewport and settled into his seat properly. Does it, for you? Nvalik adjusted the navigation input and did not answer immediately. No. The Iron Fang hit the hyperdrive. The stars stretched out into ribbons of light, and the warp tunnel opened ahead of them, blue and deep and moving. And Jacob watched it with the same uncomplicated attention he'd given it every time before. An hour in, Nvalik glanced over at him. Jacob was asleep in the co-pilot's seat, head tilted back, backpack on the floor next to him, with one strap still caught around his wrist like he was worried something might take it while he was not paying attention. Nvalik watched him for a moment, then turned back to the controls. Not completely terrible, he thought, and meant it slightly more than he had the first time. Kalina 4 looked the way some places did when no one had bothered to ruin them yet. They dropped out of hyperspace, and there it was in the viewport, a planet of deep green oceans and white mountain ranges that caught the light from two moons still visible on the far side of the horizon. From this distance, at this angle, it looked almost quiet. Jacob leaned forward in his seat and watched it grow larger as they descended through the outer atmosphere, and he thought that if you had never seen anything like it before, you would probably struggle to describe it to someone who hadn't. He had seen a few things like it before, and he still struggled. It's something, he said. Nvalik was running approach calculations and did not look up. It has resources. The oceans contain a mineral compound that's useful in ship cooling systems. The mountains are largely iridium deposits. It became a trade hub about 40 years ago when someone figured out how to extract from the lower ranges without destabilizing the upper ones. I wasn't asking for a geological survey. I know. You were making a comment about aesthetics. Right, it's a useful planet, Nvalik said. That's all it is. Jacob looked back out at the green oceans and the white mountains. Sure, he said, agreeably. Nvalik glanced at him once, then back at the controls. The buyer was a Ralith named Charon. Nvalik had briefed Jacob during the final approach, his tone carrying the particular flatness of someone conveying information they consider important and are not confident will be properly received. Raliths are collectors by nature, he said, Charon more than most. They have the kind of resources that make other collectors uncomfortable, and the kind of patience that makes everyone uncomfortable. They will be polite. They will be generous. On the surface, do not mistake either of those things for goodwill. Understood, Jacob said. You will not speak during the negotiation unless I ask you a direct question. Also understood. I mean that. Nvalik, I got it. I'll be quiet. I'm good at quiet when quiet is what the situation needs. The look Nvalik gave him suggested that he had significant doubts about this assessment, but he did not say so. They landed at a private dock on the planet's northern continent, where a representative met them with a transport that hummed so quietly Jacob could barely hear it. They were taken to a building that looked, from the outside, like it had been built by someone with very specific ideas about how stone should be arranged and unlimited resources for pursuing those ideas. Inside, it was all long corridors and low light, with display cases along the walls holding objects that Jacob did not recognize but that his brain quietly flagged as probably expensive. The air had the particular quality of somewhere that was always kept at exactly the right temperature by systems that never had to think about it. Charon was waiting for them in a chamber near the center of the building. Jacob had met a handful of Raliths before, but none with quite the presence that Charon had. They were tall, serpentine in movement and in structure, with scales that caught the light from a dozen angles at once, because they were covered in jewel-like facets that shifted color depending on how Charon moved. Their eyes were multifaceted, dark and reflecting, and when they turned to look at Nvalik and Jacob coming through the door, Jacob had the sudden clear impression of being catalogued. Nvalik, Charon said. The voice was smooth and slightly sibilant, pleasant in the way that things are pleasant when they are trying to be. It is good to see you. I trust the acquisition was uncomplicated, straightforward, Nvalik said. He set the artifact case on the table between them and stepped back. Shakran moved forward, their attention shifting immediately and entirely to the case. They opened it with care, the kind of deliberate slowness that was itself a form of theater. And for a moment they simply looked at what was inside. The artifact's glow was quiet in the room's light, its pulse slow and steady. Exceptional, Charon murmured, low enough that Jacob almost didn't hear it. They reached in and lifted the artifact with both hands, holding it at the level of their eyes. The light played across their faceted scales in patterns that shifted as they turned it. This is from the third colonial period. Do you know how few of these survived the collapse of the Vrexian outpost network? Most were destroyed. The ones that weren't were scattered. I have spent 11 years looking for this particular piece. The agreed price, Nvalik said. Of course. Charon replaced the artifact in the case with the same careful theater and turned their attention to the transfer of funds, which happened quietly and quickly, in the way that large amounts of money tended to move when both parties had sufficient motivation to be efficient about it. Jacob, meanwhile, had been doing his best to stand still and look unremarkable. This was complicated by the room itself, which was full of things that were interesting to look at. The walls were lined with objects on pedestals and in cases, some glowing, some dark, some made of materials that Jacob didn't have names for. He kept his hands clasped behind his back and moved only his eyes, which was the responsible thing to do, and which he managed successfully for approximately 4 minutes. Then he saw the device on the pedestal in the far corner. It was circular, about the diameter of both his fists placed together, and covered in symbols that were carved into its surface in a pattern that repeated but didn't quite repeat, shifting slightly each time the eye tried to follow the sequence. It was darker than the other objects in the room, not glowing but not exactly inert either. There was something about it that he couldn't look away from, and the longer he looked, the more he had the feeling that the symbols were almost legible, that if he could just be a little closer, or tilt his head slightly differently, they would resolve into something he could understand. He took 2 steps toward it before he was fully aware that he was moving. He told himself he was just going to look. His fingers grazed the surface of the device before he'd quite decided to touch it. The response was immediate. The device lit up from the inside, a cold white light that spread outward from his fingertips across the surface. And then the center opened. A mechanism he hadn't even known was there. And from the opening rose a holographic star map, 3-dimensional and slowly rotating, larger than he was, filling the far corner of the room with projected light. Stars and systems and coordinates in a language Jacob didn't know, but rendered in enough detail that the structure of it was clear even without translation. Jacob took a step back. The room had gone completely silent. He looked over his shoulder. Charon and Nvalik were both staring at him. Charon's expression had shifted from its careful pleasantness into something that Jacob did not immediately have a name for, but that he recognized, because he had seen some version of it before, in people who had just seen something they very badly wanted and had been trying to find for a long time. Jacob, Nvalik said, and the way he said it was the particular tone of a person who is calm, because the alternative is worse, but who would like a full account later. I just touched it, Jacob said. I can see that. Charon moved toward the star map, their eyes moving across the project coordinates with an intensity that made the pleasantness fall away entirely. Whatever front they maintained in negotiations had dissolved into something more unguarded and considerably more unnerving. Do you know what that is? Charon said. They were not asking Jacob. They were speaking toward the map, almost to themselves. That is not a navigation chart. That is a key to the vault of Eternum. They turned to look at Jacob with those multi-faceted reflecting eyes. The vault has been lost for 300 years. Scholars have debated whether it existed at all, and your human simply reached out and opened the seal. We're leaving, Nvalik said. Wait, Charon raised a hand, and the gesture was so controlled that it stopped the room more effectively than a raised voice would have. I would like to make a different arrangement. Whatever my original payment was, I will double it. Their eyes stayed on Jacob. For him. No. 3 times. We're done here. Charon. Nvalik put himself between Jacob and Charon with a movement that was not aggressive but was very deliberate, and his voice shifted into something that was no longer flat. It was flat in a different way. The way that empty space is flat because there is nothing in it and sound does not carry. He's not part of the deal. Charon's composure returned, but it was a different kind of composure now. The kind built over something that was still moving. You misunderstand me. I don't wish to harm him. Your human has an affinity for ancient technology that is, based on what I just witnessed, extraordinary. The ability to interface with sealed pre-collapse artifacts is extraordinarily rare. I have been looking for someone with his particular capability for years. I would pay extraordinarily well. He's not for sale, Nvalek said. The look Charon gave him was the look of someone whose calculation had just updated. I see. Well, perhaps another time. Nvalek grabbed the artifact case off the table. That is mine, Charon said, sharply. You paid for the artifact. The artifact is in the case. The case is mine. He looked at Charon with 4 unblinking eyes. The star map belongs to the device. The device was already yours. I suggest you enjoy them. He took Jacob by the arm and steered him toward the door. Jacob let himself be steered, mostly because his brain was still catching up with the last 3 minutes, and walking required less processing power than arguing. Behind them, Charon called something to someone, a clipped syllable in a language Jacob didn't recognize, and he heard the sound of movement from further down the corridor. Run, Nvalek said, and Jacob ran. They made it back to the Iron Fang, with Charon's guards close enough behind them that Jacob could hear footsteps. Nvalek was already running the launch sequence before the ramp had finished closing, and Jacob dropped into the co-pilot seat and grabbed the nearest safety restraint on instinct, which turned out to be the right decision because the ship lifted off with a speed that pressed him back against the seat in a way that left no room for anything else. The planet fell away beneath them. Jacob waited until they were clear of the atmosphere and the engines had settled into their normal sound before he said anything. I didn't mean to activate it. I know that, Nvalek said. He was watching the navigation output, not looking at Jacob, but his jaw had the particular set of someone keeping a measured distance from a response they could give, but had chosen not to yet. I just touched the surface. I was barely doing anything. I understand. So it wasn't really my fault, per se. Jacob, yes, be quiet for 10 minutes. Jacob was quiet for 10 minutes. When the 10 minutes were up, Nvalek exhaled through his nose and turned to look at him properly. You understand what happened back there. The device activated when I touched it. The device has been sealed for at minimum 300 years. Charon has been trying to open it since they acquired it 14 months ago. 3 professional relic handlers have attempted it before you. None of them triggered so much as a light cycle. He looked at Jacob steadily. You brushed your fingers across it. Jacob sat with that for a moment. Okay, yes, that's something. What Charon said about humans having an affinity for ancient technology. I've heard versions of that theory before. I didn't put much weight in it. I'm revising that. So, what does that mean? It means Charon is going to tell people what they saw. That is not something people like Charon keep quiet. And there are others who will be interested in that information. Nvalek turned back to the controls. You're more valuable than you were 6 hours ago. I'm not sure that's something to be pleased about. Jacob looked out the viewport at the dark between systems. How many people are we talking about? More than we want. Nvalek set the coordinates for their next stop and engaged the autopilot. There's a planet called Daxia 5, industrial, dense, and complicated enough that losing a tail there is still possible. We're going to try. And if we can't lose them, then we figure out what comes next. Jacob nodded slowly. This job, he said. It's more complicated than you made it sound in the docking bay. Nvalek glanced at him. Most things are. You said that before. It keeps being true. Daxia 5 was the kind of planet that had been beautiful once, or at least had been unremarkable, and had been built over so many times and so quickly that whatever it had been before was gone without a trace. The whole surface was urban in the way that happened when settlements stopped being planned and started just accumulating. One structure going up wherever there was room until there was no room left and someone built on top of the last thing instead. From above, it was honestly impressive, in a dense and slightly alarming way. Up close, the impression was less of a city and more of a system that had grown large enough to sustain itself without anyone being fully in charge of it. The upper districts were loud. The middle districts were louder. The lower districts were loud in a different way, with the particular quality of noise that comes from places where everyone is trying to accomplish something they'd prefer no one else knew about. Nvalik guided the Iron Fang into a small private docking bay in the lower middle district, paying the docking fee in cash and not providing a registration number, which the attendant accepted without looking up from what he was reading. "I want to be clear," Jacob said as they stepped off the ship into the bay's damp air. "I understand this is serious. I'm not treating this like an adventure." Nvalik considered him. "You're a little excited. I'm a little nervous, and I process that similarly." "Yes, but I'm focused." "Good. Because this place is the kind of dangerous where people don't get found afterward. Stay close. And if I tell you to move, you move immediately, not after you've finished whatever thought you're having." "Got it." The cantina they headed to first was wedged between two taller structures in a way that suggested it had been built in the space that was left over, which it probably had been. Inside, it was loud and warm and lit by fixtures that cast just enough light to see by without making anyone particularly visible, which was presumably the design intent. The smell was cooking and smoke, and something fermented that Jacob decided not to investigate further. Nvalik moved through the space with the ease of someone who had spent time in places like this and knew the rules. Don't stare. Don't move fast. Don't touch things that aren't yours. And don't make anyone feel like they're being assessed. He went directly to the bar, where the bartender, a wide-shouldered alien with 4 arms and the expression of someone who had seen everything and had opinions about most of it, was restocking something from a crate on the floor. Jacob positioned himself to Nvalik's left and did his best to look like he belonged, which was a harder ask in a place like this than it usually was. Humans were not uncommon in the galaxy, but in this particular bar, on this particular level, he was getting the kind of attention that meant he was notable in some way he hadn't yet identified. "Information," Nvalik told the bartender, sliding a stack of credits across the counter. "I need to know who's been moving through the lower docks in the last 48 hours. Specifically, anyone traveling with tracking equipment." The bartender looked at the credits, then at Nvalik, then at Jacob. "You brought a human in here." "I did. That's either brave or stupid." Nvalik opened his mouth to respond, and that was exactly when the table behind them went over, with a sound that cut through the ambient noise of the cantina and made everyone within 20 meters go briefly still. Jacob turned around slowly. A reptilian alien, built on a scale that suggested either exceptional genetics or pharmacological assistance, was standing in the middle of the floor with an overturned table in front of him, and one finger pointed in Jacob's direction. The finger was the kind of finger that belonged on a hand that had spent a lot of time breaking things. "That's the human," the alien said, not to anyone in particular, just to the room. The one from the transmission. The cantina, which had paused, resumed in a different register. Chairs scraped back. People who had been minding their business began minding exits instead. Nvalik moved without discussing it. His hand found Jacob's jacket at the shoulder, and Jacob was already moving when the first piece of furniture went airborne. And whatever happened next in the cantina happened behind them as they went through a side door that Nvalik had clearly identified before Jacob had even finished his first drink. They ran, not panicked running. Not the kind that went nowhere because it forgot to look where it was going, but the deliberate, directed kind that knew exactly where the ship was and calculated the most effective route back to it. Nvalik set the pace and Jacob matched it, and they were halfway back to the docking bay before the sounds behind them had faded enough to suggest the pursuit had lost the thread. On the ship, door sealed and engines warming up, Jacob sat in the co-pilot seat and breathed for a moment. "That alien recognized me from a transmission," he said. "Yes, Charon works fast." Charon anticipated that we wouldn't come back voluntarily. Nvalik was running the navigation input, jaw tight. By now, the details of what happened with the device are in circulation. The star map, your involvement, all of it. Who sent them? Charon has contacts throughout this sector. But Charon isn't the only one who will have received the information. He looked at Jacob. There is a network called the Syndicate. They are not a criminal organization in the conventional sense. They don't smuggle goods or control territory. What they collect are capabilities, people, artifacts. Anything they believe can give them access to power that isn't generally available. Jacob felt the particular cold that had nothing to do with the ship's temperature, and they'll have heard about what I did. They will have heard about it within hours of Charon sending word, if they haven't already. They will know your face, your species, and what you can do with sealed artifacts. He turned back to the controls, which means we no longer have the option of staying in one place long enough for this to settle down on its own. So what do? We find someone who can help us disappear. Someone with resources and motivation, and the kind of skills that formal organizations don't have. He hit the launch controls and the Iron Fang rose off the docking bay floor. I know someone who fits that description. If she's still operating in this sector. She, a smuggler. She goes by Vera. She's difficult. She's expensive. And she is not someone who gives favors. But she knows how to make things and people very hard to find. And right now, that's what we need. The ship punched through the upper atmosphere and Daxia 5 fell away beneath them. Its dense layers of city and shadow folding back into a shape that looked almost manageable from up here. Nivalik, Jacob said. What? You said we need to find someone who can help us. Not you, we. A brief pause. Don't make something of it, Nivalik said. Jacob didn't say anything, but he noted it. The stars stretched out ahead of them, cold and enormous and entirely indifferent. And Jacob was trying to calculate how far into the outer sectors they would need to go before the Syndicate's reach started to thin out. When the Iron Fang's proximity alarm went off, it was not a gentle sound. It was the kind of alarm designed to be heard through the wall of sleep or distraction, or whatever else a person might be doing when they needed to stop doing it immediately. And it cut through the quiet of the cockpit with a flat, insistent urgency that made Jacob sit up straight before he had consciously processed why. And Valak was already at the controls. 2 ships, he said, his voice clipped and focused, closing from the port quarter. Vrexian design. Jacob leaned forward to look at the sensor output. 2 shapes on the display, moving fast and in formation, which meant whoever they were. They knew what they were doing. Charon's. Charon hired them. Whether they work for Charon or just for the money is a question that doesn't matter right now. Nivalik's hands moved across the control panels with the economy of someone who had no time for unnecessary motion. Brace. Jacob grabbed the restraints. The Iron Fang pitched hard to starboard as an energy blast came in from the left and missed them by a distance that Jacob's instincts registered as close before his brain had finished measuring it. The ship shuddered from the proximity of the discharge. Something in the storage compartment behind them shifted and fell. What do I do? Jacob said. Weapons console. Second panel on your right. And Valak was already pulling the ship into a steep climbing turn that pushed Jacob's weight hard into his seat. The targeting system is already active. You need to fire it. I've never fired ship weapons. I'm aware of that. I'm just flagging it. You flagged it. Now sit down and put your hands on the console. Another evasive roll. Another blast that lit up the left side of the viewport with residual light. And Valak pulled them out of it and leveled off on a new heading. The red control on the left is the targeting lock. The trigger is the long bar below it. You hold the first one until it beeps. Then you use the second one. Jacob found the controls. They were where Nivalik had said they would be, which he found obscurely reassuring. His hands were steadier than he would have expected, though he couldn't have said exactly why, except that somewhere in the noise and the motion and the immediacy of what was happening, his brain had apparently stopped asking questions and started just doing the next thing. He held the targeting lock. The beep took 4 seconds that felt considerably longer than 4 seconds. When it came, Jacob pressed the trigger bar. The Iron Fang shuddered as the turrets fired, and for a moment nothing happened. And then the display showed the first enemy ship spinning off its attack vector, its engine signature stuttering. Hit, Valak said. I hit it. Jacob stared at the display. Again, the second one is coming around. Jacob found the second ship on the targeting display and repeated the sequence. His first shot went wide. He recalibrated for the ship's movement and tried again. The beep came. He fired. The second ship came apart in a bloom of light that the viewport's autofilter dimmed automatically. The silence after was the particular silence of a system that had just had something loud stop happening to it. The proximity alarm cut off. The sensor display showed 2 inactive signatures where the pursuing ships had been. Jacob sat back. He was breathing harder than he'd realized. You're learning quickly, Valak said. He was already resetting the ship's systems, checking the damage reports that were coming through on his display. His voice had the specific quality of someone giving a compliment that they had not pre-planned and are processing at the same time as delivering. I don't know if that's true, or if I just got lucky with the angles, Jacob said. Both things can be true simultaneously. Jacob looked at the targeting console, then at the blank space in the display where the ships had been. Did I just kill people? Then Volek paused for a moment before answering. You destroyed the ships. Whether anyone on them survived is a function of their safety systems and their own preparation. You were protecting us. That's not exactly an answer. No, Volek said, it isn't. Jacob looked out the viewport. The stars did not have anything particular to say about it, which was typical of them. Okay, he said after a while. What now? Now we find Vera before anyone else finds us. Vera's base was on a moon that didn't appear on any current navigational charts, which was either because it was too small to bother mapping or because someone had specifically requested its removal. And the answer depended on who you asked and whether you trusted them. From above, the surface was gray and pocked and covered in the slow-moving dust that low-gravity moons collected over geological time. There was no visible settlement from the approach, which was part of the point. The base only resolved into something identifiable when the Iron Fang was on final descent. And even then, it looked more like an equipment cluster than a place where people lived and worked. And Volek had sent a signal on a frequency that Jacob would not have guessed from the controls, and had received back a response that consisted of one short string of numbers that apparently meant something to him, because he nodded once and continued the descent without further comment. The surface was colder than Jacob had been expecting when they stepped out. Not unbearably cold, but the kind of cold that was persistent and indifferent and reminded you that this place had not been designed to accommodate you. The dust moved slowly around their boots. Stay close, Volek said, and Jacob stayed close. The base looked different from the inside than from the outside, which was also part of the point. What looked like disused equipment housings from above were connected at their bases by corridors that had been built, over time, into something that functioned as working space. Not comfortable, not particularly well lit, but organized in the way that working spaces get organized when someone has specific tasks they need to do, and has structured their environment around those tasks without worrying about anything else. The figure waiting for them at the center of the base was leaning against a support column, with the relaxed posture of someone who had known they were coming and had decided that pacing around to meet them wasn't worth the effort. Vera was tall, and she dressed practically. Dark layers with the kind of wear that came from real use rather than style. The glowing tattoos that ran from her wrists to her upper arms were not decorative, or not only decorative. Jacob had seen that kind of marking before on people who used them as interfaces for specific types of technical work. Her green eyes moved from Volek to Jacob, and back with the unrushed assessment of someone who was always gathering information and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. You look tired, she said to Volek. We've had a complicated few days. I know, I've been listening. She looked at Jacob more carefully. This is the one who activated the Eternum seal. I didn't mean to activate it, Jacob said. The device didn't care about your intentions. She said it without hostility, just as a statement of fact. My name is Vera. I know who you are. I know why you're here. And before we start talking about what I can do for you, I want you both to understand that my assistance is not free and the price is not negotiable. I assumed, Volek said. Good. Then we understand each other. She turned and walked deeper into the base, gesturing for them to follow. I have a proposal. It's riskier than what you came here for. But if it works, it solves the problem more permanently than just running does. They followed her through 2 corridors and into a room that had screens covering most of one wall, displaying maps and schematics and signal traces that Jacob didn't have enough context to read clearly, but that looked dense with information. There's a research facility, Vera said. She brought up a planetary map and highlighted a location in what the labels indicated was a remote system at the outer edge of the charted sectors. It was abandoned roughly 200 years ago, when the organization that built it collapsed. It contains a collection of artifacts from at least 6 pre-collapse civilizations, and somewhere in its lower levels, there is a vault that has not been opened since the facility shut down. You're talking about the Eternum Vault, Volek said. I'm talking about something connected to it. Yes, the star map your human activated is one of several keys. There are others. The vault at this facility is one of the points the map references. She looked at Jacob. And based on what happened on Kalina 4, you're the only one who can open it. Jacob chose his words carefully. What's inside the vault? That's the question, isn't it? Vera sat down at the console and turned to face them both. Various theories. Most of them agree that whatever the pre-collapse civilization stored there was something they considered too significant to leave in normal circulation. The Syndicate has been trying to locate and access it for years. They haven't managed it. If we get there first and access it, we have leverage. Something to negotiate with, or something to use. Or we find out whatever's in there, and it's something none of us want to have gotten into, Jacob said. Vera looked at him with slightly more interest than she had a moment before. That's also possible, which is why it's a risk. She turned to Nvalik. The alternative is running. You can run, but the Syndicate's reach is long, and your human's face is in circulation now. Running buys time. This ends it. The room was quiet for a moment. What's your price? Nvalik said. Vera smiled, briefly and without warmth. Access to whatever we find in the vault. Not everything. A fair share. We decide what fair means when we see what we're dealing with. Nvalik looked at Jacob. Jacob thought about it for long enough to feel like he was making an actual decision rather than just going along with what was already happening. Then he said, okay, let's go see what's in the vault. The planet that housed the facility had no name on any current chart, just a designation number that suggested it had been surveyed and filed away and not thought about again. From orbit, it was brown and deeply shadowed, its surface an uneven landscape of crags and valleys, with the occasional evidence of erosion from weather systems that had continued doing their work long after anyone was present to observe them. The facility itself was built into a valley wall, which from above made it nearly invisible. Vera navigated to it with the ease of someone who had mapped the approach ahead of time, and the Iron Fang settled on a flat area of ground about 200 meters from the entrance. The air outside was cold and held the particular stillness of a place that had not been disturbed in a very long time. Jacob stepped out and listened, and there was nothing to hear except the wind moving across the valley and the small settling sounds of the ship behind them. Quiet, he said. Abandoned facilities usually are, Vera said, and checked the device at her wrist. Let's move. The Syndicate will know about this location. It's only a question of how much time we have. The facility was dark, in the way that places go dark when the power has been off for long enough that even the emergency systems have exhausted themselves. Nvalik produced a handlight and Vera produced another, and between them they had enough visibility to move through the corridors without walking into things. Mostly, the walls were covered in markings that Jacob kept wanting to stop and look at properly. They were not decorative, or they were not only decorative, they had the quality of inscriptions, language that was functional and mattered to the people who wrote it, even if the people who had written it were long gone and the context for understanding it had largely gone with them. He kept moving, because stopping was not an option, but he was aware of them, in the way you're aware of something peripheral that keeps asking for attention. The vault door was at the end of a long corridor on the facility's lowest accessible level, and it was immediately clear why no one had been able to open it. It was not a mechanical door, or not primarily. The surface of it was covered in symbols, arranged in concentric rings that overlapped and interlocked in a pattern that changed depending on which part of your visual field you were using to look at it. The metal it was built from had the quality of something that was not interested in being analyzed, its composition reflecting scan attempts in a way that suggested active resistance rather than simple opacity. Jacob stood in front of it and looked at it for a long time. There's a sequence, he said. Yes, Vera said. We've identified that much. Nobody has been able to determine the sequence. It's not arbitrary. He reached out slowly and touched one of the symbols at the outer ring. These aren't just symbols. They're states. Each one has two positions, and the transition between them is part of the language. He tilted his head. It's like a lock, where the combination isn't a series of numbers. It's a series of changes. You have to move through them in a specific order, and the order is encoded in the symbols themselves. Can you read it? Nvalik asked. I don't know if read is the right word. Jacob pulled the device Vera had handed him earlier from his jacket pocket. It had been calibrated for this kind of work, she had said, without fully explaining what that meant. When he held it near the door's surface, it responded. the display showing outputs that corresponded to the symbol states in a way that was almost like translation. Almost. It's like trying to hear a conversation through a wall, Jacob said, mostly to himself. I can tell there's something there. I just need to. He stopped talking and started working. What he did next was not something he could have fully explained to someone who asked him afterward. It was partly the device, which helped him track which symbols he had already moved and what state they were in. It was partly the patterns he had started noticing in the facility's wall inscriptions, and which now seemed to be providing context he hadn't known he was gathering. And it was partly something that he had no good name for, a sense of rightness when a symbol moved in the correct direction that was not quite intuition and was not quite knowledge, but was somewhere in between. Light began to move through the symbol rings as he worked, starting from the outermost and progressing inward, each ring illuminating when its sequence was complete. It's working, Vera said, low and involuntary. Jacob didn't answer. He was concentrating. The innermost ring completed. The door began to move. It did not swing or slide. It opened the way things open when the mechanism was designed to be impressive. The rings separating and drawing back into the wall in stages, the light from within, filtering through incrementally until the full opening was revealed in cold, stale air moved past them from inside. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the sound came from behind them, down the corridor, the unmistakable sound of multiple people moving fast and not trying to be quiet about it because they no longer needed to be. And Valak had his weapon up before Jacob had fully processed the sound. Vera's energy blade was in her hand, the faint hum of it audible in the suddenly quiet air. 3 figures in heavy armor came around the far bend of the corridor and stopped when they saw the group. They were well equipped and moved in the practiced formation of professionals. The armor bore no insignia that Jacob recognized, but Ninvalik clearly did, because something in his posture shifted into a different register. Syndicate, he said. The armored figures looked at the open vault door, then at the 3 of them, and the leader raised a weapon. Then the far wall of the corridor exploded. It was not a large explosion, more precisely directed than catastrophic, but it did what it was intended to do, which was to fill the space with enough noise and displaced air to interrupt what was happening and give everyone present a moment of confusion to work with. From the smoke that followed, a figure emerged. He was tall and lean, moving with the unhurried ease of someone who had caused the explosion intentionally and knew exactly what came next. His face was angular, with the particular kind of attractiveness that worked best when paired with a complete absence of trustworthiness. And he was holding a blaster in one hand that he had clearly already decided how to use. He looked at Vera first. "You've made new friends," he said. His voice was pleasant in the way of someone who had learned that pleasantness was the most effective delivery mechanism for all manner of outcomes. Vera's expression did not change. "Trent, that's still my name." "Yes." He shifted his attention to Nvalik with the brief acknowledgement of an old familiarity. "You look good." Slightly pursued, but good. His eyes moved to Jacob with the particular quality of someone cataloging something they've heard about and are now seeing in person. And this must be the human everyone's so excited about. "What are you doing here?" Nvalik said. "Currently, saving your lives." "I'd think. You can thank me later, in the form of a favor, which I'll specify when I need it." He turned to the syndicate enforcers, who had held their position during this exchange in the way that people hold position when they are reassessing what they walked into, and whether the situation still favors them the same way it did 30 seconds ago. Trent's reputation, Jacob would learn later, had that effect on professional calculations. "I suggest you leave," Trent said to the enforcers. "My friends and I have things to look at in there, and we'll be occupied for a while. You can come back, of course, but I'll have had time to prepare for that, and you'll find it considerably less pleasant than just making the practical decision right now." The enforcers exchanged a look. Their leader said something in a clipped tone that was probably a profanity in whatever language it was, and then signaled a withdrawal. They backed down the corridor and around the bend, and the sound of their footsteps faded. Jacob let out a breath he had not entirely known he was holding. "Who is that?" he asked. "Someone I owe a favor to," Nvalik said, which clearly answered nothing, but was apparently all he intended to say about it right now. Trent had already turned back to look at the open vault door with an expression of genuine, uncomplicated interest. "Well then," he said, "shall we see what we came for?" The vault smelled like time. Jacob had never had a good way to describe that particular smell before, but standing in the entrance of the chamber, with the cold air moving past him from inside, he thought that was the closest he could get. It was not the smell of decay, because the preservation systems had held well enough that nothing inside had decayed. It was the smell of something that had been sealed for so long that the fur itself had lost its connection to the world outside and become its own separate thing, existing in suspension, unchanged while everything around it continued forward. He stepped through the entrance. The chamber was large, larger than he had expected from the corridor outside, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above them. The walls were lined with equipment and objects arranged with the deliberate organization of someone who had expected them to be found eventually and wanted the finder to be able to make sense of what they were seeing. Some of the equipment glowed faintly with residual energy that had outlasted the facility's main power by centuries. Others were dark and still, and clearly waiting for a charge that was not coming. Jacob walked slowly through the first rows of shelves, turning his head as he went. He did not touch anything. He looked at everything. Trent had moved to the left side of the chamber and was examining something with the practiced eye of someone who had spent considerable time evaluating the market value of unusual objects. Vera went right, toward the equipment banks along the wall, and Jacob could hear the small sounds of her technical assessment running. And Valak stayed near the entrance for a moment, watching the corridor behind them, before he was satisfied enough to move further in. And then Jacob saw the pedestal. It was in the center of the chamber, lower than everything around it, positioned in a shallow depression in the floor that had clearly been built specifically to hold it. The pedestal itself was simple, a column of the same material as the vault door, functional rather than decorative. What sat on top of it was not simple. The orb was about the size of both of Jacob's fists placed together, and it was blue in the way that the deepest parts of things are blue, not reflecting light from outside, but generating something that was close enough to light to read as such, while being clearly different on some level Jacob could not quite name. It pulsed slowly, not like a heartbeat, more like breathing, an expansion and contraction that was almost too slow to see, but that you felt if you stood near it long enough. Jacob felt it. He stopped about 2 meters away and looked at it carefully. "That's it," Valak said, from somewhere behind and to his left. "Yes," Jacob said. "You can activate it." "Probably, yes." He did not move closer yet. "I'm taking a moment. We may not have many moments. I'm aware. I'm still taking one." The orb pulsed. The light from it moved across the floor and the nearby shelving in waves that were almost imperceptible. And Jacob stood there and breathed and tried to think clearly about what it meant to reach out and touch a thing when you did not know what reaching out and touching it would do. The answer he arrived at, after his moment, was that he did not have enough information to make a fully informed decision, and that this was probably not going to change, and that the syndicate enforcers who had been in the corridor 15 minutes ago would not stay gone permanently, and that standing here thinking about it was not the same as making a choice. He took 2 steps forward and reached for the orb. The contact was not gradual. The moment his fingers closed around it, the energy moved through him all at once, not in a wave but instantaneously, as though the transfer had been waiting and his touch was simply the permission it needed. He felt it in his hands first, then his arms, then throughout his entire body. Something that was not quite warmth and not quite electricity, but shared qualities of both. The chamber filled with light. Not the orb's slow blue pulse, but something larger and faster that came from the pedestal outward and hit the walls and reflected back and kept going. And the floor shook. One long sustained tremor that sent dust falling from the ceiling and made the equipment on the shelves vibrate against their housings. Jacob held on. He did not know what he was doing exactly. He knew that he was not letting go. The light reached the far wall of the chamber, where the floor-to-ceiling surface had shown no opening, and it found something there that Jacob had not seen. A seam, thin as a cut, running from floor to ceiling in a vertical line. The seam lit up from the bottom as the energy moved through it, and then the wall began to move, drawing back into itself in the same staged way the vault door had, revealing a space beyond that was dark and deep, and going further back into the planet's rock face than Jacob could see. He heard shouting, He looked up. Chiron was standing at the vault entrance. They had not come through the corridor that Trent had collapsed. They must have had another way in, a secondary entrance that Vera's map had not shown, or that had been kept from the facility's available schematics. They were flanked by 6 guards in armor that was heavier than the Syndicate enforcers. Personal security rather than organizational muscle, and every weapon in the group was pointed into the chamber. Charon's eyes found the orb in Jacob's hands and then moved to Jacob's face with the quality of someone arriving at a conclusion they had been building toward for days. "Put it down," Chiron said, with the calm of someone who had decided not to need to raise their voice. "I will not damage it. I want it intact. But I will damage everything else in this room if I need to." "Charon," Nvalek said, "save it." The calm was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. "I've spent 11 years building toward what that orb represents." Nvalek, 11 years. "And a human I never accounted for is standing in this chamber holding it because I was not fast enough." They looked at Jacob with something that was past anger and into the territory of pure calculation. "So I'm adjusting. The orb comes with me. You have the option of walking out of here and calling it a loss." "Jacob," Nvalek said. Charon's expression did not change. That was always going to be the harder conversation. Nvalek moved. It was not a negotiation continuation, and it was not a warning shot. He came off the wall of the chamber with the speed of someone who had been waiting for the conversation to reach a terminal point and had identified the terminal point 3 exchanges ago. His first shot took out the rightmost guard before anyone in Charon's group had fully registered that the conversation was over. Vera was already moving left, and Jacob had just enough time to see Trent go down behind a shelf of equipment before the noise of the firefight filled the chamber and made individual tracking of anything impossible. Jacob dropped to the floor behind the pedestal. The orb was still in his hands. He could feel the energy from it in his arms and chest. That sustained low hum that was not going to let him forget it was there. The stone of the pedestal was between him and the main firefight, and he pressed against it and tried to make himself smaller. The sounds were too close and too many at once. Energy blasts hitting the equipment shelves and sending sparks and fragments of old machinery in every direction. Nvalek's voice, once sharp and directional. Vera's blade, its hum cutting through the general noise. Glass or something like glass breaking somewhere above. Jacob looked at the orb. It was still pulsing, but differently now, faster. As though it was responding to what was happening around them, or to him, or to something he couldn't locate. He heard Nvalek's voice again, and this time it was his name. He came up from behind the pedestal. 2 of Charon's guards were still standing. Charon themselves had retreated to the vault entrance and was directing from there. Their composure fractured now. Their movements fast and without the layered calculation they'd had 2 minutes ago. Nvalek was behind a turned-over equipment rack. Vera was somewhere he couldn't see. Trent was on his feet with a look of profound annoyance and a burn mark on his left sleeve. Jacob looked at the orb. He made a decision that was not really a decision because it was the only thing he could do that was not doing nothing. He stood up straight, and he held the orb up, and he pushed. He did not know what he was pushing. He was not sure push was even the right word. It was closer to releasing something he had been holding back since the moment he'd picked the orb up, something that had been accumulating and building alongside the noise and the fear and the need for this to stop. The energy came out in all directions at once, a pulse that was visible as a ring of light expanding from his position. And when it hit Charon's guards, it did not hurt them, but it moved them, decisively and without room for argument, sent them back against the vault walls and held them there for a moment of complete stillness. Charon looked at Jacob, for the first time since he had known of them. They looked uncertain. The pulse had also done something to the chamber. The wall behind Jacob, the hidden passage that had opened, was now lit from within by the same energy, and the structure around the opening was making sounds that Jacob recognized with some instinct he couldn't identify as structural. "We need to go now." Vera's voice, from somewhere to his left. "The hidden passage," Jacob said. "Now, Jacob." He ran. The passage went back further into the rock than it had looked from the chamber, and it was narrow enough that Nvalek's shoulders were close to touching both walls simultaneously, and the light was only what the orb in Jacob's hands provided, which was enough but not comfortable. Behind them, The facility was making larger and more varied sounds than it had been 10 minutes ago, which Jacob interpreted as the structural responses to the energy discharge still working themselves out. The passage ended at a maintenance exit that opened onto the planet's surface about 400 meters from where the Iron Fang was sitting. They ran across the open ground with the facility behind them, building towards something conclusive. Jacob could feel the vibrations in the soles of his boots. He did not look back. He had seen enough films about people looking back at the wrong moment to have a strong opinion about not doing it. The Iron Fang's engines were already warming when they reached the ramp, which meant Trent had gotten ahead of them at some point and done something useful. And as soon as everyone was aboard and the ramp was sealing, the ship lifted without ceremony and moved fast toward the upper atmosphere. Jacob looked back through the viewport. The research facility came down in stages, which was not as dramatic as a single large explosion, but was arguably more complete. The valley wall it had been built into absorbed most of the structural collapse, and the dust cloud that followed moved upward and outward and gradually thinned into the planet's atmosphere. He sat back. He was still holding the orb. He looked at it for a long time, sitting in the co-pilot's seat while Ninvalik flew them clear of the planet, and Vera ran damage assessments from the rear console, and Trent sat in the narrow corridor behind the cockpit with his legs stretched out and his burned sleeve still smelling faintly of scorched material. "Jacob," Ninvalik said, after a while. "I know," Jacob said. "You're still holding it." "I know. I'm working out how I feel about that." The orb pulsed in his hands, slow and steady as it had been when he'd first seen it on the pedestal. But there was something different now. When he had picked it up, the energy had moved through him and then continued outward, into the chamber. Now it felt like the energy had moved through him, and some of it had stayed. A residual warmth in his arms and chest that was not fading the way warmth usually faded. "Ninvalik," he said. "Yes, something is different." Ninvalik turned to look at him. Vera looked up from the console. Even Trent opened his eyes. "When I grabbed it in the chamber," Jacob said, "the energy moved through me and went outward. That's what opened the passage. That's what pushed Charon's people back." He paused. "But it didn't all go out. Some of it is still here." He touched his sternum. "In here." The silence that followed had a particular quality. "Can you feel it specifically?" Vera asked, in the tone of someone asking a technical question. "Yes, it's not uncomfortable. That's part of what worries me." He set the orb carefully on the console between his seat and Ninvalik's and looked at it. "What is this thing?" Ninvalik looked at the orb, then at Jacob, then back at the controls. "Honestly, please, I don't know everything, but what I know is more than I've told you." He exhaled slowly. "The Eternum Vault and the artifacts connected to it are not the remains of a single civilization. They are what was left by a network of civilizations that existed before the ones we know about now. Pre-collapse. Pre-colonial. Before most of the species currently operating in this galaxy had developed interstellar travel. They had power, and they understood it well enough to be afraid of it. Afraid of what specifically? Of what they had built. The orb is not a weapon. It's not a tool. In the conventional sense, it is closer to a repository, a storage system for a type of energy that their technology could generate, but that they eventually concluded should not be in active circulation. He glanced at Jacob. "They sealed it away because they could not destroy it." "That's not a reassuring thing to find out you're holding," Jacob said. "No," Ninvalik said, "it's not." Vera crossed the cabin and stood near the orb, not touching it, looking at it, with the focused expression of someone running calculations. "The energy you said stayed inside you. The Syndicate will be able to detect that. Not the orb itself necessarily, but the resonance it leaves in a host who has made contact." She looked at Jacob. "That's what Charon meant when they said you were priceless. They weren't talking about what you can do with artifacts. They were talking about what happens when the artifact stays with you." "Which is what?" "We don't know yet," Vera said. "That's honest." Jacob looked at his hands. They looked like his hands. They felt like his hands. But there was that warmth, sitting somewhere deep in his chest, and it did not feel neutral. It felt like potential, which could mean many things, most of which required choices about how to use it. "The Syndicate is going to keep coming," he said. "Yes," Ninvalik said. "And other people will come once word spreads further. Charon knows what happened in that chamber. Charon tells people things." He looked at the orb. "So running keeps buying us time. But it doesn't change what I'm carrying or what people will do to get it." Nobody said anything, because he was not wrong. I want to get rid of it, Jacob said. Trent, from the corridor, said nothing but opened his eyes. Vera looked at Jacob steadily. By get rid of, you mean destroy it, whatever it takes. He picked the orb up again, felt the pulse of it against his palms. Not hide it, not hand it off to someone we trust and hope that's enough. Destroy it, so there is no it left to be chased for or taken or used. He looked at Nvalik. Is that possible? Nvalik was quiet for long enough that Jacob started to think the answer was no, and was preparing himself for that. There are places, Nvalik said finally, ancient sites, places where the civilizations that built this created processes for exactly this kind of problem. The problem of a power that cannot be destroyed by ordinary means. He looked at Jacob with something in his expression that was not quite reluctance and not quite respect, but was in the territory between them. One of them is within range of our current position. A moon, no designation. It doesn't appear on modern charts. Does it appear on the star map? Jacob asked. The one the device on Callan 4 projected. Nvalik was quiet for a moment. Yes. Jacob looked at the orb one more time. The blue light moved across his palms. Then that's where we're going, he said. Trent sat up in the corridor. For what it's worth, he said. That is a very sane decision for someone in a very unusual situation. Thanks, Jacob said. I'll be leaving before you actually do it. Obviously, favors have their limits. Obviously, Jacob said. He set the orb back on the console and looked out the viewport at the stars. And he thought about the warmth in his chest that was not going away, and what it meant to carry something that should not exist, and what it would feel like when it was gone. He did not know the answer to the last one yet. He was going to find out. Trent left them at the edge of the outer rim. He came forward to the cockpit somewhere in the middle of the journey and stood in the narrow space between the two front seats with his arms crossed and the expression of someone who has already made a decision and is waiting for the most efficient moment to announce it. This is where I get off, he said. I know, Nvalik said. I said favors have their limits. I meant it literally and not as a metaphor for emotional investment, which I want to be clear I have none of. He looked at Jacob. For whatever it's worth, you handled yourself well back there. For a human who had no idea what he was doing. Thank you, Jacob said. That's almost a compliment. It was exactly a compliment. I'm just precise about what kind. Trent uncrossed his arms. I'm taking the shuttle from your secondary bay. Don't argue about it. I wasn't going to. Nvalik said. Good. He turned to leave, then stopped. Nvalik, whatever the thing on the moon is, be careful with it. I'm always careful. You're always effective. Those are different things. He left without waiting for a response. They heard the shuttle bay cycle a few minutes later. The brief pressure change that indicated the secondary doors had opened and closed. And then the iron fang was lighter by one person, and the corridor behind the cockpit was quiet again. Vera, from the rear console, said nothing. She had been running quiet for most of the journey, which Jacob had come to understand was not her version of disengagement, but rather how she worked when she was thinking seriously about something. He's not wrong, she said, eventually. About which part? Nvalik said. About effective versus careful. She did not look up from the console. What we're going to do on that moon isn't a retrieval. It's not a negotiation. It's not the kind of thing that can be planned for in the way you plan for most things. That matters. I know what it is, Nvalik said. I know you do. She paused. I'm saying it out loud for Jacob's benefit. Jacob looked over at her. I know what I'm doing. Do you? She said it without challenge, genuinely asking. Jacob thought about it honestly, which took a few seconds. I know what outcome I want. I know why I want it. I don't know exactly what will happen when I try to make it happen. He looked at the orb, sitting in the recessed holder between the seats where they had placed it, still pulsing with that slow blue light. I've been carrying this for 2 days, and I can feel it more clearly right now than I could when I first picked it up. That's not stopping. It's increasing. Yes, Vera said, which means if I don't do this now, the question of whether I can do it at all gets more complicated as we wait. Yes, she said again. So that's why I know. She looked at him across the cabin, and something in her expression shifted, not into warmth exactly, but into something that was adjacent to respect in the way certain cold things are adjacent to light without being the same as it. Fair enough, she said. The moon had no name because nobody who came here stayed long enough to give it one. That was not something any of them said. But Jacob felt it when the Iron Fang broke through the upper atmosphere and the surface resolved below them. It was not an ugly place. The geology was old and clean. Pale rock formations rising from a flat gray plain, eroded by whatever passed for weather here into shapes that were almost deliberate, almost like something that had been arranged rather than left. The light from the nearest star hit it at an angle that cast long shadows, and the shadows moved slowly as they descended because everything here moved slowly. Valak set them down on the edge of a wide flat area at the base of the largest formation. The landing strut settled into the ground with a crunch that felt loud in the silence outside. They stood at the base of the ship for a moment before moving. The air was cold and thin and tasted like nothing at all. Jacob had the orb in his pack, wrapped in the insulating cloth Vera had found in the supply compartment and handed to him without comment. He could feel it through the material, the pulse of it against his lower back where the pack sat, and the warmth in his chest that had been there since the vault was stronger here, like something recognizing where it was. The temple should be inside the formation, Vera said. She had the facility's schematics on her wrist display, cross-referenced with the coordinates from the Eternum star map. There will be an entrance in the northern face, if the structural integrity has held. 200 years, Valak said. These structures were built to last longer than that. She started walking. Come on. The entrance to the northern face was not obvious until you were standing in front of it, at which point it was unmistakable. A rectangular opening cut directly into the rock with the deliberate precision of something that had been placed there rather than worn there by natural process. The edges were sharp after all this time, which said something about the material they had been cut from. Inside, the darkness was complete. Vera's light came on, and Valak's followed. Jacob walked between them into the rock. The temple was not what he had expected, though he would have struggled to say what he had expected. It was not grand in the way of things built to impress visitors. It was grand in a different way, in the way of things that had been built with a complete and serious understanding of their purpose and no interest in anything beyond that purpose. The corridor that led inward was high enough that even Valak did not have to duck, and it was carved from the same pale rock as the exterior. The walls smooth in the way of surfaces that had been worked for a long time until everything unnecessary was gone. The symbols began about 20 meters in. They were not the same as the symbols on the vault door at the facility, though they shared something. A family resemblance of construction that Jacob recognized now the way you recognize an accent. He had spent 2 days with the orb's energy in his chest, and something had shifted in how the markings on walls like these reached him. He still could not read them as language, but he was beginning to understand their logic. The way you understand a piece of music before you can play the instrument it was written for. He kept walking. The corridor opened eventually into a chamber, and Jacob stopped in the entrance and looked at it. It was circular, which was different from the facility's vault. The ceiling was domed, and the dome was not solid, or it had not been originally. The rock above had been cut away in a pattern that now let in the pale light of the moon's thin sky. Long shafts of it angling across the chamber floor, in lines that the room's circular geometry had clearly been designed to accommodate. In the center of the chamber, lit by 3 of those shafts meeting in a single point, there was a pedestal. It was the same material as the one in the vault, the same height, the same construction, but this one was empty, waiting. Jacob crossed the chamber to the pedestal and stood in front of it for a long moment. The dust on the chamber floor showed no footprints except the 3 sets they had just made coming in, which meant no one had been here in a very long time, possibly ever, since it was sealed. The light from the shafts above was cold and clear and did not flicker. Jacob, Valak said, from behind him. Give me a minute. He took off his pack. He removed the wrapped orb from inside it with both hands. He set the pack on the floor. Then he stood with the wrapped orb in his hands and thought about what he was doing, with the full, clear attention he believed the moment deserved. He thought about the device on Kalina 4 and the star map that had appeared from it. He thought about Charon's face when they had seen it, and what that expression meant about how long someone could want something and what it did to them over time. He thought about the cantina on Daxia 5 and the reptilian alien pointing at him across the room, and the look on Valak's face when they got back to the ship. Not angry, not even frustrated, just carefully not expressing something that was there. He thought about the firefight in the vault and the sound of energy blasts and the feel of the old floor beneath him. He thought about standing up with the orb in his hands and releasing something he had not known he was holding. He thought about the warmth in his chest, which was still there, and which he had spent 2 days not entirely hating. That last one was the important one. He did not hate it. There was something in it that was genuinely extraordinary, a connection to something larger and older than himself that he might have spent a long time trying to understand. If the situation had been different, he might have had that time. But the situation was not different. The situation was that this power, in him or in the orb or distributed between both, was something that people would follow him across the galaxy to take. And the people who would follow him were not careful. They were not Charon, who at least had the restraint of a collector. The further word spread, the more of the other kind would come. The ones who were not interested in what it was but only in what it could do. He unwrapped the orb. The blue light filled the chamber, brighter here than it had ever been on the ship, and the dome above seemed to respond. The shafts of natural light changing quality, and the shadows on the walls moved in ways that shadows were not supposed to move. Jacob placed the orb on the pedestal. The moment it left his hands, the temperature in the chamber changed. It was not colder or warmer. It was different in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, a quality and shift that Jacob had no good word for, except that it felt like being acknowledged. Like having been walking through a large and indifferent building and finding unexpectedly that the building knew you were there. And then the voice came. It was not a sound. It was closer to the certainty of a sound. The way you sometimes hear something in a dream that you know perfectly well was never audio. It arrived in him fully formed, in something that was not language but that he understood completely. You carry what was given. You are the point through which this passes. I know, Jacob said, out loud, because it felt wrong to respond in kind to something that large. What you carry has been sought for longer than your kind has walked among the stars. To carry it is to be always at the center of what others want. Yes, Jacob said. I know that, too. The light from the orb was filling the dome now, reflecting off the pale rock in every direction. Then Volok and Vera had not moved from the entrance of the chamber. Jacob did not look back at them. The choice offered is to take it fully, to make it yours, to become what those who built this place were afraid to become. Jacob put both hands on the pedestal on either side of the orb and looked at it directly. That's not the choice I'm here to make, he said. A pause that had the weight of something very old adjusting to something it had not expected. Not the first time this has been offered, I figured, and I figure some of them took it. He steadied himself. I don't want to be the key to something I don't understand. I don't want to be the thing that people spend years hunting because of what they can use me for. And I don't want what happened in that chamber to happen again, to anyone, because of what's in here. He pressed his palms flat on the pedestal, on either side of the orb, and felt the energy of it moving up through his arms and into the warmth in his chest that had been sitting there for 2 days. So this is what I'm choosing. I'm giving it back. The light intensified. The warmth in Jacob's chest, the thing that had settled there in the vault and grown steadily on the journey here, began to move. Not outward this time, downward, through his arms, into his palms, toward the orb. He had no technique for this. He did not know the mechanism of it. He simply wanted it, with the same completeness and clarity that he had brought to everything else he had done in the past week. And he let the wanting do the work. The orb absorbed it. He felt it go, in the way you feel a fever break. That moment when the thing that had been present in you shifts from inside to outside, and you are aware of both the absence and the relief of the absence at the same time. The warmth moved out of him steadily, and the orb took all of it. And when the last of it was gone, Jacob felt genuinely empty, in a way that was not the absence of something bad, but the absence of something that had been extraordinary. That distinction mattered. He felt the loss of it, plainly and without pretending he didn't. The orb's light reached a point that should have been too bright to look at and was somehow not, and the chamber walls moved, the symbols on them running together and apart in a way that might have been language, and might have been something language was not adequate to describe. The pedestal shook. Jacob stepped back, and then the light went out, not gradually, not in a fade. The orb was there, pulsing blue, and then it was not there, and the pedestal was empty, and the chamber was lit only by the pale shafts coming through the dome, and the small lights that Invalik and Vera still held at the entrance. Jacob stood in the center of the chamber, with his arms at his sides, and looked at the empty pedestal. His chest felt clean and cold and entirely his own. Behind him, neither Invalik nor Vera said anything for a long moment. The silence in the chamber had its own quality now, different from the silence of before. Lighter, somehow. The silence of a place that is finished holding something, rather than the silence of one that has been waiting to give it up. Vera spoke first. "Is it done?" she asked. "Yes," Jacob said. She exhaled, a small sound that carried more in it than its size suggested. Invalik walked across the chamber to where Jacob was standing. He looked at the empty pedestal, then at Jacob, with all four of his eyes focused and steady. "How do you feel?" he said. Jacob considered the question honestly, because Invalik had asked it directly and deserved a direct answer. "Empty," he said. "Not bad empty. Just, it was there for 2 days and now it isn't." He looked at the pedestal. "I knew what it was. I could feel the shape of it, and I gave it up." He paused. "I think I made the right choice. I'm also allowed to notice that something extraordinary is gone." Invalik was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "You are." They stood there for a bit, in the pale light of the domed chamber, and the moon went on doing what moons did around them, turning slowly in the light of a distant star, carrying this quiet room inside its rock the way it had been carrying it for centuries. Then Vera said, from the entrance, "When you're both done being contemplative, I'd like to not be on this moon anymore." Jacob almost smiled. Fair. They were back in hyperspace before anyone tried to have a real conversation about what came next, which seemed like the right order of operations. The Iron Fang ran quiet, the way it always did in warp travel, that steady blue tunnel of moving light, filling the viewport, while the rest of the galaxy waited for them to arrive somewhere. Jacob sat in the co-pilot seat with his legs stretched out and his arms loose at his sides. He felt tired in the particular way that comes after something large has been completed. A full-body tiredness that was not unpleasant. "The Syndicate will lose interest," Vera said, from the rear console, where she was checking her own ship's coordinates on a secondary display. "It'll take time. But without the orb, and without the resonance in you, there's nothing to track." "And Charon," Jacob said. "Charon lost what they were after. They'll cut their losses." She paused. "Charon is many things, but they're not vindictive without a purpose. Revenge with no practical upside doesn't appeal to them. That's a moderately comforting thing to know about someone who tried to have me detained. Take comfort where you find it." Jacob looked out the viewport for a while. "What do you do now?" he asked Invalik. "What I was doing before you showed up in the market corridor and decided I needed an assistant, which is work, movement, the usual." He adjusted something on the navigation panel without particular urgency. "You, me, what do you do now?" Jacob thought about it. He thought about Luminina Prime and the 6 days he had spent there, running low on credits, leads falling through, deciding to approach a Vrexian bounty hunter with a reputation everyone else treated as a warning and that he had treated as an opportunity. He thought about the first mission, and the scanner that Invalik had called useful and then corrected himself to call an observation. He thought about hyperspace for the first time and pressing his forehead against the viewport. "I'm a pretty good assistant," he said. Invalik did not answer immediately. Then, "Your scanner needs recalibrating. The secondary frequency drifted during the fight in the facility. I noticed it after." Jacob looked over at him. "That's not a no. It's an observation." "Right." Jacob reached down for the scanner, which was still in his jacket pocket, where it had been since they left the facility. "I can fix the calibration in about 20 minutes. Do it after we land." "Sure." He put the scanner back. "Invalik." "What?" "For what it's worth. I'm glad I approached you in the corridor." Invalik was quiet. "You'd disrupted 3 weeks of straightforward work and created a situation that required us to fight off 2 hired ships, escape a meeting with a Ralith collector who has contacts across 4 sectors, navigate the lower districts of Daxia 5, locate a smuggler I have a complicated history with, break into an abandoned research facility, fight through a syndicate retrieval team, activate an ancient power source of indeterminate origin, and travel to an unmapped moon to perform a ritual that nobody living has ever done before." He paused. "I'm revising my assessment of what counts as straightforward work. Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation." "You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." Jacob looked out the viewport again. The warp tunnel moved around them, that deep and rushing blue, and the stars outside it were waiting, the way stars waited, with the particular patience of things that had been there since long before this ship or its passengers, and would be there afterward too. He was not a hero. He was reasonably clear on that. Heroes had a quality of predestination about them, as though everything that happened to them was building toward the moment when they would do the thing they were always going to do. In Quancher, Jacob had not felt any of that. He had felt uncertain and scared in specific moments, and useful in ways he hadn't anticipated, and deeply glad more than once that he was not alone. He had felt, for the first time in a long time, like someone whose life was going somewhere that wasn't yet visible, but that existed in the direction he was moving. That was enough, more than enough, probably. He settled into the co-pilot seat and watched the tunnel of light carry them forward, and he thought about the next destination, wherever it was, and what Nvalek would call it when Jacob asked. Probably work, movement, the usual. That sounded about right.